I want to switch
Pro
topics
e
now
contra.
to something you just briefly touched on, and that is, Israel right now. Because what's interesting is the United States foreign policy seems to be contradicting itself. On one hand, we want to, try Vladimir Putin for war crimes. We want to say that everything that Russia is doing is bad. But on the flip side, America is supporting an occupation, in Palestine. We are sending an endless amount of weapons and ammunition, billions of dollars to Israel. Netanyahu controls a tremendous amount of power inside the United States. Some would argue that even more power than the president, the way that he dictates the Israeli lobby. I want to shift and get your thoughts on this war, the other war that the United States is certainly involved in, because Israel is, heavily involved in this attack in Gaza, but it's the United States that is supporting that. So, Colonel, let me know your thoughts on the Israel-Gaza conflict as of today.
Well, setting aside whether or not the attack on 7 October was a genuine surprise to the Israelis, or somewhere along the line someone made a decision at high levels to let it happen, is beyond the scope of our discussion, because I don't know.
Right.
I have visited the outskirts of Gaza. I saw the security systems there. My impression was that it was expertly secured.
Right.
The notion that there could have been a surprise is hard for me to accept. They claim it was, so until we have proof to the contrary, we'll go along with it. But the bottom line is, defense of Israel does not require the wholesale annihilation or expulsion of 2.2 million people from Gaza, let alone additional hundreds of thousands or millions from the Western Bank. But that is essentially what has begun. The war is well beyond anything connected to 7 October. And the argument that in order to annihilate or destroy the roughly 25 to 29,000 Hamas fighters requires the mass expulsion and murder of hundreds of thousands, either directly or through starvation or exposure to the elements, is ludicrous. I can't justify it. It's incomprehensible to me that anyone would do that in this day and age, that some alternative cannot be found. But that's the case right now. And if you raise objections to it, as I pointed out earlier, inside the Beltway, Israel has a right to defend itself. Well, no one has ever questioned that. Right. I have always supported the existence of Israel and its defense. I still do. Mm-hmm. But I can no more support the mass expulsion and murder of hundreds of thousands of Arabs or millions of Arabs than I would the expulsion and murder of hundreds of thousands of Jews or millions. I can't. And I think a lot of us feel that way. But that doesn't seem to make much difference. The truth of what's happening rarely penetrates the mainstream media in the United States, as you know from personal experience. So that's the first thing. Second thing is this ugly tendency to characterize anyone that disagrees with the policy as a bigot or racist and anti-Semite. It's just absurd nonsense. Has nothing to do with it. And then finally, as you pointed out, the Israeli lobby is enormously powerful. Over the last 2 to 3 decades, I think one can argue that they've done a brilliant job of making members of the House and the Senate heavily dependent upon income from them. Right. Now, when I say income, what I'm talking about is a situation where someone walks in and says, if you unconditionally support Israel in anything it wants, we will give you X amount of money. On the other hand, if you don't support Israel unconditionally for anything it wants, well then, we're going to give the money to your opponent. And since this money comes almost 100% from people inside the United States who are hedge fund managers, business tycoons, billionaires, and millionaires. In other words, what the people in Israel would call the Jewish diaspora, which is a way of referring to Jews that don't live in Israel, that are overseas. They would insist that this is not a foreign lobby at all, but a domestic lobby. But in reality, it's a foreign lobby. It's just that the money comes from within the country. So they control everything. They do. And they control substantial portions of, if not most of the media in Hollywood. They certainly control most of your news outlets. There are exceptions, obviously, but not terribly many. And so whatever you get is going to be slanted in favor of whatever the Israelis are doing. And there are a lot of people that don't want to challenge this. Now, I haven't talked about the evangelicals. That's an entirely different group of people who honestly believe that they should do this based on their interpretation of biblical text. I'm not going to get into an argument with people on theology. That's their business. I think they're misguided on these things. And I think what is morally right and what is morally wrong is absolutely clear in this setting at this time. But that's a matter for those people to sort through. But the bottom line is, under the circumstances, I don't see anything changing there. Now, what are we looking at in the near future? I think it's inevitable that Mr. Netanyahu will launch an attack on Rafah. I suspect he'll wait until Ramadan is at an end to do that.
Right.
Normally, not a great deal happens during Ramadan. An awful lot has happened beforehand. They still bomb the place routinely, but I just don't think that'll happen beforehand. But I could be wrong. Secondly, I think he will ultimately turn on Hezbollah and go north. Now, why? Why would he do this? Because he has a choice. He can either say, very well, this is out of control, this has gone too far, in which case he will be viewed as having surrendered the initiative. Remember, he has characterized this operation, and most Israelis see it as an either-or proposition. Either we do this or we die as a state, which I've never thought was true, but that's the way they see it. And their view, I think, now is can be justified in one sense. They've done so much damage to the Muslim Arab world, to the human beings that live there in the eyes of hundreds of millions of Muslims, that the possibility of going back to some sort of normalcy probably is very unlikely. I think he either surrenders or gives up, in which case he'll be thrown out of office because the population is still behind this, or he escalates. Now, if he escalates, he's betting heavily, particularly against Hezbollah, that we could be dragged in to support him with our air and naval power, because he's going to assume that he can't really defeat Hezbollah without assistance. He's probably right. The danger, of course, is that lots of people sitting on the sidelines may leave the sidelines. You attack Hezbollah and you do that kind of damage, this may compel Iran to come to the aid of Hezbollah. They already have supported Hezbollah indirectly because of the Shiite Arab militias that you have down in Yemen, as well as in Iraq and Syria. Then you have the Turks. And Mr. Erdogan has talked a great game, but thus far has done nothing. In fact, Mr. Erdogan is selling oil to the Israelis, as well as food and other commodities that the Israelis need. His population is furious with him. They're very angry. If you and I went out on a street corner anywhere in Turkey and said, all those who want to volunteer to fight against the Israelis for Gaza, I think you'd have several million volunteers. And the Turkish military is potentially very large and very capable. Now, people say, well, they have a fragile economy, they have problems with their currency. All of that shrinks to insignificance since the peninsular Arabs, I think, would come to their aid. Right. Then the other problem is Egypt, and secondarily Jordan. Both of those countries are witnessing internal social upheaval. You have the Muslim Brotherhood that receded into the background after Sisi established himself in a coup. They are now roaring back into action with a vengeance. And the Egyptian population is at least as angry and upset as are the Turks with what's happening in Gaza. The situation inside Jordan is similar. The difference is there are 100 million people living in Egypt. They're living on an infrastructure of 40 million. Egypt's government has failed to deliver on multiple promises. It's funded lots of what I would call vanity projects that have done nothing to improve the standard of living or life for people in Egypt. So you have a confluence between, on the one hand, domestic discontent stemming from the failure of the regime to deliver, along with absolutely unbridled anger at what's going on in Gaza. Inside Jordan, you have a very tough leader in the form of King Abdullah. He certainly is sympathetic to it, but he knows that his population is at high risk if it goes to war with Israel. He wants to preserve the country. At the same time, he wants to do whatever he can for the people in Gaza. That's getting tougher and tougher with each passing day, because you've got at least 1 million Palestinians living in Jordan who are willing to pick up arms and cross the river and fight. Now, we haven't talked about what can happen in Iraq. That's another powder keg as far as I'm concerned, which is one of the reasons President Trump wanted to get out of it a few years ago. The problem in Syria is that we and the Israelis have been backing the Kurds, and the Kurds have been terrorizing the Turks. There's nothing that Erdogan would like to do more, especially before the elections this fall, than go in and crush the Kurds. But while he's doing so, that's simply an opportunity to turn his guns elsewhere as well. And he has a substantial navy that poses a threat. He could take over Cyprus quickly and use that as a strong point for the launching of airstrikes. I mean, there are all sorts of things that could happen. Right. Then, of course, you have the Russians. And the Russians aren't going to sit around and watch us pulverize Iran if the Iranians come to the aid of Hezbollah. They'll become involved. And certainly Russia is not going to allow Turkey to be destroyed in a war either. And of course, behind behind Russia stands China. Not because China, is sympathetic in any way or shape or form to Muslims per se, although they have nothing against them, but the Chinese are very dependent on oil and gas through the Persian Gulf.
Right.
That will almost certainly be shut down if Iran is dragged into a war with Israel and the United States. And then, of course, they're very dependent upon the arrival of food that comes out of East Africa. That all of this goes across the seas and up to the Strait of Malacca into China.
Right.
This is something the Chinese don't want to see blocked. So they will come in immediately to support Russia, barring the possibility that they could be blockaded inadvertently as a result of what we're discussing in the region. The whole thing could rapidly run out of control is the bottom line.
Right.
And I have a feeling that we're going to see that begin to happen after Ramadan. How rapidly, I don't know. I can't predict, which fire is going to burn the hardest first,
right.
But we're on a bad road.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Colonel, for breaking down. I mean, because it's really a time bomb it's just going to keep escalating. And as you can see, I mean, you lay down the groundwork here for this really being potential for World War III and dragging in so many different countries and just really getting completely out of control. I think one of the things that we've seen is, Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer. He did come out a couple weeks ago and say that Netanyahu is the biggest obstacle to peace in the Middle East. He had a very powerful speech that obviously was not supported by the Netanyahu regime. I mean, he was very upset about that, immediately came out blasting him. Of course, you have some people within our Senate and our Congress that had pushed back against Schumer. Do you think that was really, kind of the Democrats trying to somehow save some face here? Because, at one point, we've just passed a bill to send an additional $3.8 billion to Israel. And the same standpoint, we are, blocking now foreign aid to the UNRWA, which is the only relief agency that actually provides humanitarian assistance to the people in Gaza. I just think the United States is in a very difficult spot right now. We are just contradicting ourselves. I mean, we just continue to blindly support Israel. And my big question here is, do you think that this is going to be, influencing the presidential election? I mean, could this be Biden's inability to control Netanyahu? Is that going to come back and bite him this November?
Well, first of all, I don't think Chuck Schumer was terribly serious about any of it. That was sort of a smokescreen designed to give, as you say, the Democrats and President Biden some cover.
Right.
He wasn't taken seriously in Israel because they know he's not serious. You heard him speak. I've supported Israel all my life. There's no one who's more supportive of Israel than I am. Effectively declaring himself to be an Israeli, and that's in previous speeches. So no, I don't take that seriously at all. Right now, I don't think most Americans are paying a lot of attention to what's going on in Israel. But for that matter, I don't think Americans have paid much attention to what happens in Ukraine.
Yeah.
The truth is that this is beyond our borders. Most Americans are not interested in what's happening beyond our borders. They're very interested in what's happening along the southern border. Correct. They're interested in the dramatic rise in criminality in the cities and across the country, some of it from people crossing the border. They're beginning to wake up to the reality that this gaping wound in our underbelly is allowing all sorts of people into the country who wish us harm, who are potential terrorists themselves. And we don't have the adequate protection for our infrastructure, critical infrastructure that we need. We can't even recruit for the armed forces. The quality people that we've had over the years don't want to go in. They've all been trying to get out. Yeah. I have two nephews serving right now, one in the Navy and one in the Army, and both of them, frankly, are going to do what they can in the future to complete their terms of service as officers, and then they're out. Yeah. They're looking around and say everybody they know who is really top of the line is getting out. Nobody wants to be there. This is a bad formula for the future. It bodes ill for us as a nation. And I think that's where Americans are much more focused. But they could be surprised very suddenly by what happens in the Middle East after Ramadan. And we should be concerned about that for the reasons we've already covered. As far as Ukraine is concerned, NATO is in disarray. It's falling apart. Behind the scenes, they're frightened. They don't know what to do. There is no leadership from Washington. Right. Everything is impulse driven. There is no strategy. It's all emotion. We're the liberal international order, the globalists. We're right. You're wrong. You must do what we say. Well, good luck with that formula. That's gone nowhere. Yeah. So it's you say, well, will this come back to hurt Biden? I can't see anything that won't hurt the man, or for that matter the people in government. But then finally, you have the question of electoral integrity. And millions of us look and say, where's the evidence that we can hold a free and fair election?
Colonel, those are some fantastic insights.
Everyone, as we conclude today's video, I hope you can see the incredible danger the U.S. blind support to Israel has led to. Many geopolitical experts have said that Putin's movement in Ukraine could spark a regional war involving all of Europe. But let's not kid ourselves. The real war posing the biggest threat to a regional conflict most definitely is in the Middle East, and it certainly involves Israel. The turning point for everything could be Israel's invasion into Rafah, where over 1 million Gazan people are sheltering and fighting every day for their survival. Netanyahu has claimed that Israel has no other option but to continue the carnage and will not stop until Hamas has been eliminated. But now we are 6 months into this conflict, and that goal of eliminating Hamas seems even more impossible. Netanyahu continues to lose popularity around the world, but even inside Israel, as many people protest against one of the most corrupt leaders in the Western world. As the colonel speculated in the beginning of the interview, is it possible Netanyahu let down his guard on October 7th intentionally in an effort to justify his attacks on Gaza? That's certainly a plausible theory, at least now. But one thing is for certain. If the IDF launches a ground offense in Rafah, it will lead to hundreds of thousands of innocent lives being slaughtered and more international outrage against Israel. This will, of course, affect everything from regional politics in the Middle East to the very future of the U.S. election. Everyone, thank you for watching today's episode. If you want to understand the real reason Netanyahu holds so much power over U.S. presidents, you need to go back to 1996 and study what happened the first time Netanyahu met with then-President Bill Clinton. Trust me, you will not believe this story, so click here to watch this entire presentation. Thank you all for your incredible support, and I look forward to seeing you all in our next video soon.
Thank you for watching, like and subscribe.